Hello class, welcome to the first lesson in understanding the macro models. So this is the introduction to the models, and we are going to do three. We're going to do the classical model, which comes down to us. Well, they all have their roots in Adam Smith, but the classical model comes down from the economists behind him. And I've marked it as Alfred Marshall in 1890 because Marshall is the one that published the first textbook that used math. In fact, supply and demand first appears in Alfred Marshall's book and so forth. But there were plenty of classical economists before him, including David Ricardo and Say, and I've forgotten the others at the moment. The market process model, sometimes called the Austrian model because it came out of the University of Vienna, and there were a bunch of Austrian economists before this guy, Karl Menger, but their names are so long I'd have to look them up to see how to spell them. But Menger wrote a book in 1871 also, I think, called Principles of Economics, and quite different from the book that Alfred Marshall published, and we'll discuss that in a minute. And then a little bit later on the scene comes this guy, John Maynard Keynes, in 1936. Keynes wrote The General Theory. The actual title of that book is The General Theory of Interest, Income, and Money, I think, or I might have the title a little bit wrong. It's funny how things repeat themselves in history. You might remember that Adam Smith's book that we call The Wealth of Nations actually had a much longer title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. His book was an attack on the prevailing views of his day, and Keynes sort of did the same thing again. He has this shortened title here. The actual title is longer, and Keynes's book is really an attack on the prevailing theories of his day, which were these two. All right. So there are other theories. You could list them down here, but we're not going to cover them. You know, obviously Marxism is a macro model, and there are plenty of others, but these are the three most popular ones, at least in the Western tradition, and so those are the ones we're going to do. Okay, so now the first way to separate them out is to think about which models focus on equilibrium and which models focus on dynamics. It should be obvious that the classical model and the Keynesian model, even though they're very different from each other, they both focus on equilibrium, where the market process model, as its name implies, is more dynamic, focuses on the dynamic process. Another way to separate these things out is to think about which ones accept aggregation and which ones reject it. Now, this word aggregation is used in a lot of different areas of the economy. So in economics, it's talking about aggregating up data. So in those other lessons that we did on the metrics, almost all of those things were aggregated up. So like the inflation rate is an aggregation of all the different prices that are moving around, some moving up fast, some staying the same, some actually falling. Or the unemployment rate. So we have the single number of the unemployment rate, but actually the unemployment rate is quite different depending on your age and your job skill level and where you live. So the classical model and the Keynesian model both accept aggregation. They talk about things like equilibrium income. Keynes especially does this. He talks about this conceptual concept of aggregate demand. The market process model, of course, rejects that. Now, this word reject is a little bit stronger than what they're really talking about. It's not so much that the market process economists think aggregating up stuff is wrong. They don't think that. They just think it's not useful in understanding what's going on in the economy. So to them, their colleagues over here who are focusing on aggregation are kind of wasting their time, and they should be looking somewhere else. Okay, so another way of looking at this thing is about how long it takes markets to clear. So the classical model thinks markets clear pretty quickly, in fact at the extreme, I would say. So you have supply and demand. Whenever there's an adjustment in the marketplace, either the demand curve or the supply curve moves, and we attain a new equilibrium pretty quickly. The Keynesian model has got the other extreme, and it thinks that markets don't clear very well at all. And the Austrian or the market process model is somewhere in between. It follows logically because they are, after all, about the process of moving, how does the economy respond to changes. So in the classical model, they don't think about the response. They just look at, when the dust settles, where are we? But in the market process model, it's all about how we get from one equilibrium to another, even though they would argue that we never actually reach an equilibrium because there's so much chaos in the economy that the equilibrium is constantly dancing around and we're just following it. Alright, so that's the one about market clearing. So the last one to think about is which ones think we require government management of the economy. And in this case, the Keynesian model is the only one that thinks we require government management. The other two don't, but for different reasons. The classical model holds that the economy is self-correcting so that we don't have to do anything. The market process model would agree that the economy is self-correcting even though it would take quite a while for it to do that. But their position is more that, well, if we do engage in managing the economy, it's very, very likely that we will make things worse, not better. Alright, so that's one way to think about these three models. Another way to do it is to think about the assumptions behind them, and that might be a better way. So in the classical model, we have this idea that markets clear. That is, that supply and demand works pretty well. So when something happens, one of those curves moves, there's kind of chaos for a few minutes, the dust settles, and then we have a new equilibrium wherever the new supply or demand curve intersect. Alright, so then it follows logically in the classical model that if markets clear and supply and demand works pretty well, then the economy is self-correcting. Should anything happen, we don't need a Secretary of the Economy to direct resources. They will be directed kind of like Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand, not, that famous quote, not by the benevolence of the baker or the butcher, but by their own self-interest. They're directed as if by an invisible hand to provide those things that society values most. Remember this quote? So that's the classical position. So we can see the classical position in a simple supply and demand illustration. So let this be the labor market. So here we are in equilibrium. So from the classical perspective, the only way that there can be unemployment would be if the wage is too high. So I'm going to draw the wage up here for a minute. This is how classical economists would view unemployment. So now we have the quantity demanded of workers. So, the labor demand, these are potential employers. When the wage is too high, this is how many workers they want. And then, of course, when the wage is high, this is how many people are looking for work. And this, of course, the difference between the number of people looking and the number of jobs that are available would be unemployment. So this is how classical economists would view unemployment. And their response would be, there are tremendous pressures trying to drive this wage down because it's out of equilibrium. We have a surplus of labor. So these market forces trying to drive this wage down will eventually cause the wage to fall back to equilibrium, and then all is good. We don't require government intervention to solve this problem. So that's the classical view. Now the Keynesian view is, well, pretty much the opposite of that. They would argue that markets don't clear. And if they're trying to be nice to their classical colleagues, they would argue, well, okay, maybe they do clear, but they clear very, very poorly. There's a famous quote from Keynes. If this wasn't such an accelerated class, we could have a little fun talking about the man, John Keynes. He's one of the very few economists that actually was well known. He was actually a quite famous person because he wrote a scathing essay about the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. And it turned out, at the time he wrote the essay, it was kind of scandalous, but it turned out that he was completely correct. And so he became quite famous, and people were always asking him things. So once he was somewhere, and some reporters asked him, Professor Keynes, what about the classical position that markets clear? And he's reported as saying, well, yes, markets clear in the long run. And then he paused a minute and he said, but in the long run, we're all dead. In the long run, we're all dead. So his point was, well, okay, market's clear maybe in the long run, but why wait? Why wait all that time? And we should step in there now and do something. So the Keynesian model is all about, government managing the economy. So markets do not clear, supply and demand works poorly, therefore it follows that the economy must be directed. So this is the way a Keynesian economist would view that same problem that I put up here about the labor market. So this is the classical view right here. Now Keynes would argue that these market forces that are driving the wage back down to equilibrium are very, very weak, and that this wage might persist up here for a very long time. So Keynes's idea is, instead of waiting, what we should do is stimulate the economy and move the demand curve for labor out here. That way the wage isn't too high anymore, and in fact all this just disappears, and now we have a new equilibrium out here. It's a very seductive idea, but it does require a big assumption that we haven't covered yet. If we stimulate the demand curve for labor, you have to think about, where did all these extra workers come from? Remember, the old equilibrium was over here, and now we got this new equilibrium out here. Where did all these workers come from? The model, the Keynesian model, assumes that there's large amounts of idle resources all in the economy. Sometimes they call it slack, slack in the economy. Lots of resources laying around, so that when the government does stimulate the economy, all that happens is that those resources are pulled into productive work. So if that wasn't true, let's say that the classical model was actually true, but you had on your Keynesian glasses and you were trying to manipulate the economy through Keynesian assumptions, all that would happen is you would drive up prices. Because when you tried to stimulate the labor demand curve, all it would do is pull workers out of jobs that they already had and put them in other jobs. So I pulled this image off the internet. This is a famous movie from about 10 years ago. I think it was called The Cinderella Man. This is the lead right here. And this, let's see, where'd my mouse go? This is the lead right here. And this scene happens early in the movie. They all work at this factory. This is the factory gate right here. This hat that you see over here, the back of this person, this is the foreman, the factory foreman. And every morning the factory foreman walks out to the gate, and here are all these unemployed people standing outside, all kind of pushing to get in. And the foreman would say, okay, today I need 3 workers. And he would say, you, something like that. They would crack the gate open, and those 3 unemployed workers would come in, and all the others would go home. So this scene is in almost every movie. In fact, I would say every movie that's set in the Great Depression. Usually it's just like this. You see how it's kind of bleak? There's no color here. It's almost always winter. It's usually raining, and they're just kind of standing around shuffling their feet, sometimes getting liquored up a little bit as they wait and hope that the factory foreman will give them a day of work. So if you hold to that idea that you have a lot of slack in the economy, then the Keynesian prescription works pretty well. All right, enough of that. Now, the market process model takes this idea that market's clear, but it takes time. So in this particular assumption, it looks like the market process model is kind of picking some middle ground in here someplace. And that's fair. That might be true about that assumption. But the next assumption is really quite different, that prices coordinate buyers and sellers. Now, this is on the forefront of the market process model, and it's not like classical economists and Keynesian economists disagree. No, everybody agrees that prices coordinate buyers and sellers. It's just that the classical model and the Keynesian model don't talk about this much. They just kind of assume it works and we don't need to talk about it. But in the market process model, it's on the forefront. So you could think of it like this. If you aggregate up stuff, like if you focus on the price level or the inflation rate, you lose all of the information that's about all these relative prices. Here's kind of a joke that I heard one time by a famous Austrian economist. He said the Keynesian model, Keynesian economists would take a phone book. Okay, so now this story I'm telling you is a bit old, and you got to have to think about what a phone book is. But back in the day, before we had Google, people had these books in their houses, and they were tiny, tiny little print and lots of pages, and it listed everybody that had a phone and their phone number. So this Austrian economist made this point, that a Keynesian would look at this phone book and all those numbers, and they would say, well, this is really too many numbers to manage. Let's just add up all these numbers and divide by how many phone customers there are so that we'll get the average phone number. Now let me ask you, if we had the average phone number, that is, we took everybody's phone number, added up, and divided by how many of us there were, would that number have any information in it? So in the Austrian view of things, no. When you aggregate stuff up, you lose all the information, the important information that's embedded in the individual prices that coordinate buyers and sellers. So then this last assumption is that when the state, when the government directs the economy, it discoordinates markets. That is, it causes chaos in markets and it makes things worse, not better. So in this particular assumption here, they look a little bit like the classical model, but for a completely different reason. The classical model thinks that we don't need government intervention in the economy because the economy is just self-correcting. The Austrian position is we don't need government intervention in the economy because they will make things worse. All right. Now, I'm going to try one more time to make these distinctions between the models, but I'm going to use a simile. And if you don't remember what a simile is, you can look it up in some old English book. All right, so classical and Keynesian models view the economy as something like a tightly bound engine. An engine, or maybe a car, or maybe a ship. So I'll pull this image off to give you an idea of what they're talking about. If you have a tightly bound ship, the idea is that you can speed it up or you can slow it down. So in the case of the economy, you can speed up or slow down the economy through the judicious use of monetary and fiscal policy. That is, with the tools, the macroeconomic tools that we have for governmental policy, we can control the economy. We can, for example, steer the economy between the perilous straits of inflation and unemployment. Now, I didn't make this up. This is actually a quote from a book way back in the 60s where this economist, who's kind of obscure now, but this economist first used a simile of the economy as a ship and the economist as the pilot of the ship using the navigational tools of monetary and fiscal policy, steering the ship between the perilous straits of inflation and unemployment. Now, you may have never seen this phrase anywhere, but I bet you've seen this one, that we need to keep the economy on the even keel. This phrase comes from that very same book, and you can't read the financial section of a newspaper for a week or so without seeing a reference to the economy as somehow keeping it on an even keel. You know, keep unemployment low, keep inflation low, and so forth. All of those writers who write this, who probably all got their undergraduate degrees in journalism and never took an econ class, have no idea where this phrase came from, the even keel. But I'll tell you, it comes from this economist. His name was Walter Heller, who wrote a book in the 1960s called New Dimensions of Political Economy. And he wrote that thing during the golden age of Keynesian economics. And the book is so optimistic that nowadays people, if you were to read it, you would laugh about how unbelievably optimistic they were. Back in those days, they really thought that the Keynesian model would solve for all time the problem that we had had since the Industrial Revolution, and that is the kind of fits and starts that the economy would go through. You know, it would expand and then it would contract, and it would expand and contract and so forth. And so this guy and all the other Keynesian economists of that day thought that problem had been solved because we could steer the economy. Now here's another image of the kind of Keynesian view, It's not quite as impressive as a ship. Instead, it's a car. And this guy, you probably don't recognize, his name is Ben Bernanke, and he was the chair of the Federal Reserve, let's see, 2 chairs ago. So the current person's name is Jerome Powell, and before Jerome there was Janet Yellen, and before Janet there was this guy, Ben Bernanke. And he was my favorite, even though I wasn't a big fan of his monetary policy, but he's my favorite because the guy was from Dillon, South Carolina. Dillon. I'm from Florence. That's not very far away. We're about the same age. I probably ran into this guy somewhere. Anyway, Ben Bernanke, and he's a Keynesian. See, he's steering the ship. The ship, of course, is this car here, and he's reading the economic gauges. See, the credit cards, auto loans. I can't quite read that one, but he's reading these gauges, and he's deciding to speed up or slow down, turn left or right, the economy. All of that is really a Keynesian view of how the economy works. Okay, so now in the case of the market process model, things are very, very different. The market process model does not view the economy as something tightly bound. Instead, the economy is more like a living organism, like a flock of birds or a school of fish. So I got this fish image up here to sort of point this out to you. You notice the fish, they're connected and they move together, kind of like a ship, but they're not tightly bound up. You can't push against one of these fish and all the others will follow in proportion. My guess is if you poked one of those fish, the other fish would scatter in some kind of random way. So this is a great analogy of the economy through the eyes of market process economists. Another way to think about it is the economy is more like a sensitive environmental ecosystem. I think actually that's a great way to think about it. The economy kind of like a living organism, a very complicated system full of feedback loops, some that we understand but many that we don't. So I pulled this view off here, and there are a lot of stories for those of you who did your undergraduate work in one of the sciences, especially biology. There are a lot of stories about missteps in biology over the last 100 years, things that they thought, kind of naive assumptions they had about the environment, that they could come in maybe and, remove a particular thing, and they thought the environment would just respond in some predictable way, but they were always surprised. The economy is the same way. It is just as complicated as the kind of complicated system we have in any kind of ecosystem. Or you could think of the economy like a garden. Okay, so enough of that. So words like stimulate, contract, steer, keep on an even keel, those kind of words make no sense in the market process approach. So I'm going to push this idea one more time and then I'll put it to rest. So here's the bottom of a ship. Here's the propeller right here that drives the ship. I don't know what this rail is for. I mean, who would grab a hold of that thing? But anyway, so you have this propeller, and the idea is you can speed up or slow down the engine, and this little propeller, this tiny little dot on this huge ship, will push the whole ship forward or backwards or steer it left or right because the thing is tightly bound. You can push right here and the whole ship moves. And so that's kind of like the Keynesian model, in that we can stimulate the economy through monetary policy, and basically all monetary policy is action by the central bank to lower an interest rate. So we lower one thing in the economy, the interest rate, right? So that would be like this place right here, and the whole economy will respond in some understandable way. Now if you translate that to how the market process economists think about things, you're going to push against this one little fish here, but it is not true that all the other fish are going to respond in some kind of predictable way. They're going to respond in some kind of chaotic way. So that kind of explains, maybe too much, the difference between the classical model, Keynesian model, and Austrian model. So I have this last slide here to kind of summarize what we've done. Unlike the Keynesian and classical models, the market process model rejects aggregation because it is the information in those individual prices that direct resources. You aggregate all that stuff up, you lose all that important information. Like the classical model, the market process model assumes all resources have alternative uses. Resources are not laying idle like is often assumed in the Keynesian model. So we don't have these large pools of unemployed workers just sitting around hoping that somebody will call them in for a job. So now, don't let me oversell this. It's not like classical and Austrian economists don't think there's unemployment. Yeah, there is. But in their mind, the unemployment has some systemic reason. That is, like the job is in Dallas, but you live in Charleston and you have, for some reason, that you can't move. Or your job skills are in X, but the jobs available are in Y, or you have some other reason, right? Some reason other than inadequate aggregate demand that's causing you to be unemployed. All right, and so like the Keynesian model, market adjustments take time. So the Austrian model, yeah, would line up with Keynesians on this thing. It takes time, not forever, but it takes time for markets to adjust. They're not perfect. Okay, I hope you found that helpful. Oh, one last thing. So it looks like in this one, it looks like that I've spent probably a disproportionate amount of time on the market process model, and that's a fair criticism of this lesson. But the reason I did it is because in the next lesson we're going to do the math of the classical and Keynesian models, and the market process model really doesn't have any math, and so the next lesson will be mostly on classical and Keynesian models. Okay, good luck.